Hello! In this episode, I'll be talking to author and teacher Elisabeth Sharp McKetta. Elizabeth is the author of 13 books, including She Never Told Me About the Ocean, Arc, and Edit Your Life, a handbook for living with intention in a messy world. We'll delve into the importance of creativity, mental health, and the practice of writing, but Elizabeth also shares her experiences of living in a tiny house with her family, emphasizing how the simplicity and minimalism of small spaces can enhance focus and creativity. I am confident you're going to learn some things in this episode, but I have to say it's worth a listen because Elizabeth is a gorgeous human being. Elizabeth, hi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Stuart, thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here, and I just love your podcast and love getting a chance to talk with you. Thank you for having me on.
That's very kind of you. I will send you a check in the post. Now, as we talk, I see you are in a tiny office.
Tiny office.
Now, what I learned from your TEDx talk about editing your life like a poem, tiny spaces play a significant part of your life now. How did that begin?
Yes, tiny spaces do take up a lot of my, tiny spaces are something that I love. And I love especially the idea of doing a lot with a little or living a big life in a tiny space. And when our tiny house and tiny office story began, we were living in Boise, Idaho, which is a really lovely small town in the Intermountain West, in a house that was of the size that you sort of graduate from your starter home into in the US after having kids and getting a dog and a job. And it was a big American house. And it was a beautiful house, and a house that felt like we were teetering on the edge of being able to manage, both in terms of sort of everything that was expensive that needed to be done. And also we had two small babies and one old dog and one young dog, and it felt like everything inside was utter chaos all the time. So when our friends ask, why did you, have you heard of moderation? Why did you move into a place so small? My answer is always, my first answer is sort of money, and my husband's is mess. But all of it was sort of a chaos that we just felt like, why are we spending so much time on these things that are utterly, maintenance or faff, as you might say in England.
Right.
And really the whole goal of this enterprise, when we decided we would set up jobs so that we could work at home and be with our kids and design our life to be of a size that each one of us could carry so that the other could be the whole person they needed to be. It felt like the distraction of all of these material objects was taking us away from that. So what we decided to do in the sort of, it was one of those decisions, like I think a lot of decisions that we've made as a family, where there's sort of a attention and attention and attention and a lot of just nonsense solutions flung around, mostly by me, resulting in a single guillotine choice to leap that looks spontaneous and unthought out, but is actually the sort of end of a long journey of thought and creative what if. And in our case, we had, before we moved into the big American house, had a little starter home 2 blocks away with and built an office behind it of 275 square feet. I don't know if that would be in meters, like 3 by 9, I think.
I have no idea.
Okay, fair.
I live in a country that's in imperial measurements. So
okay, fair.
It's feet and inches as far as
okay, feet and inches, about 275 square feet. And it was meant to be, well, initially it was meant to be an office for me, although that would have been served by just a portable tough shed in the backyard. But because we were becoming parents far away from grandparents, we thought it would be the mother-in-law, and grandparents could come and stay. And then when no one was staying there, I could leave writing workshops in there, which I did, and which I really enjoyed. It could fit exactly 6 people comfortably sitting in a very small circle. And then, so this was sort of left to be rented out for extra income when we moved. But my mind kept drifting back to it as a place that just felt like a symbol of simplicity, that nothing could fit in there except for the life being lived right now. And I think because it had an association for me of writing and creativity and conversations with writers, it felt like a room, and it was just a room with a loft dedicated to the essential things. Certain spaces just feel good, just felt kind of easy and clean and inclusive and uncomplicated. And so anyway, and it was a complete little house, is a complete little house. So when we both felt like we really kind of needed a change, and just didn't want to miss that era of, having very small children and enjoying them, that felt like the simplest thing we could do was rent out the big house and move into the shed. Even though it seemed ridiculous, it felt like the most, what is it that they say in the next right step? Felt
Okay,
like the
yeah.
next right step. And we tried it for a week in the spring before moving in the fall, just to sort of see how do we inhabit this space. And it was pretty easy. Everything we, all of the sort of principles that we had been trying to live by or trying to teach our children, like um, tidy as you go was a big one with a 3 and a 6-year-old, or you know, no, respect people's quiet before 9 a.m. and after 9 p.m. These sort of little rules that, like, when there's no enforcer, you're like, well, we could just have this conversation at 10 p.m. Or you don't really mind my mess on that table. It felt like the house itself sort of enforced those principles just because everyone was sharing space. So we sort of couldn't, we couldn't live any other way. So it felt like this really wonderful imperative to kind of live in alignment with our principles. We had these little kids in Montessori school who, decided because of the lack of space that they would share all their toys. It was very sweet and very simple. And it made me realize that a lot of my energy as a writer had been going into thinking about what I now call the floor, which is to say
Okay.
any part of the foundation of how do I write? Where do I write? How do I afford the writing? How do I make a schedule that doesn't conflict with this other thing? Just sort of all of the logistics around the writing had become so time consuming. Whereas in a tiny office, like where I'm speaking to you now, really all that fits in there is the writing.
Right. Okay. And I guess to a degree, your mind.
Yes, exactly. Like you and the question.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So let me just back up a little bit. So you buy your starter home, you build a tiny house in the back garden, you then buy the big American dream home, and you're renting your starter home out. Is that right? And then you make
Yes.
the decision to actually move from your big American dream home into a tiny house. So what kind of square footage are we talking you moved from?
From about 3,800 to about 300, because we added on a little
Wow,
extra unit for the tiny office. So huge change,
that really
huge
is.
change.
And the thing is, I always forget how big American homes are. So I'm very lucky to live in a house that's 2,500 square feet, which is a 5-bedroom house in
Yes.
the UK of a good size. They call it an executive home. So it has, a built-in study and, big double garage and all of that kind of stuff. So in my head, I live in a really big house. So yeah, I'm just making that a mental adjustment. Now I'm in the process of moving to an 18th century thatched cottage in the middle of nowhere. Right.
Wow.
And I am panicking because I love stuff. Right? I have, lots of different hobbies and interests. I have racks full of material. I have display cabinets full of over 100 Ken dolls. I have Wonder Woman action figures, Superman action figures, a big collection of Star Wars Lego. There is nowhere to put it in this house. And a part of me, I'm selling some stuff on eBay, but a part of me is I'm going to have to put it in storage because emotionally,
Yes.
I'm not at a place where I can let go of those things. And even here in my office, which is, good size, I'm writing a book set in Edwardian England, and I have bought things from the Edwardian era, antiques, to actually put around me in my desk. So I'm kind of immersed in that
Yes,
world. And, I start to associate those things with a book. So
yes,
when that book is done, I don't know how ready I am to be able to leave those things.
yes.
What wisdom would you share with me about that before we actually get to kind of how to edit your life to aid writing?
Yes, well, it may be that this is a beautiful question, and I love the colorful description of all of those things. And I would say that this is very much a question of life editing, because when I think of editing anything, I think of identifying the shape that this thing, be it a poem or a novel or a year or life in a new house, wants to take. Right?
Yeah,
Like, it's not all editing is saying like, oh, I think this novel, I think it's trying to be this. It's not
right.
that yet. But if we agree that this is its ideal version, then all we need to do is replace, switch chapter 1 and 2 and take out the middle. And, we just need to sort of remodel it a little bit.
Yeah,
And it feels like part of the responsible question we ask when we're looking at a life is, what are the energy sources? What feels good to live in this life? What is exciting? And it sounds like, for example, the Edwardian book, it sounds like these objects are just really inspiring and sort of reassuring and just fun scaffolding for getting in the mood to write it. So they seem like
yes,
they are they're scaffolding for this moonshot project that is very deliberately chosen by you as part of your life, your first choice life. And so I would say those seem to be something that should stay. Those don't seem like there's any reason why those wouldn't belong. So when I think of editing, I think of what are the things that don't fit anymore. And it may be that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when that book is, feels just kind of far away in the past, that then you look at those objects and they feel like someone else would do better with them, or a local museum would get a kick out of doing a display with
yeah,
them,
yeah,
or your nephew who loves these things would love to put them on his, in his cabinet of curiosities, who knows? But it may be that there's a point where it feels like, okay, I'm ready to let that go. And we always know that point. We always
but
know something's ready.
yeah. And do you know what? I think the really interesting word that you used is scaffolding, because at some point you take the scaffolding down and the
Yes,
building stands on its own.
yes, yes. This
So
is a
maybe publication day.
maybe publication day,
It
or
all
maybe
goes on eBay.
I love it. Or maybe the day after, as you're popping the champagne and toasting the book. I love that, because you're right. I think a lot about scaffolding, Stuart, because and I'm curious if this is something that I think this is worth looking at as writers and as people who coach writers, because so much I think of of a of a book or of a creative project is, or I mean, of a life, let's start with life, is just scaffolding to make sure the essential thing holds. Like, I think about in my own life, like something like, pick a goal, like I want to have a strong marriage. There's a good goal. So the scaffolding is like Tuesday date night, or like having some, going for walks, whatever, all these things that are wonderful, and that they uphold the sort of molten goal of connecting with spouse. But over the years, I imagine, things, we won't need the same ones. There will be
Yeah,
those will come down. And if I think we're sort of, not to say that, who's not to say Tuesday date night forever, but that as those things change to make way for new forms of the relationship, that seems entirely right.
yeah,
Or just, and for a book, one of my favorite examples in my own writing life, where I mistook the scaffolding at first for the project itself, was this really, really cool challenge of a project that I was sort of commissioned to do, which was a scientific biography of this celebrity chemical engineer who was approaching his 100th birthday, who also happened to be my grandfather. And I was tapped to do it both because I loved him and knew him really well, and because I was the sort of closest person to him in the family and in his sort of, close-knit group who had academic writing skills, who could do the kind of research and who was, who could write, who could research, and also who felt really invested in him. And so I was tapped to do it. And at that point, I was pregnant with my second child and did not have any confidence that I could write this book because I'm a poet mostly. I'm not a biographer. I am not a scientist at all. I didn't do very well in science. And so I thought, in this sort of illogical way, you circle a big project that you don't quite feel up for. I imagine like circling a mountain, just thinking, where do I put my foot here? Like, where do I put the first foothold to get? I know I want to go up there, but how? I thought, well, first I need to get a master's degree in chemical engineering, and then next, all these sort of impossible things with like a soon-to-be infant. And then I finally, after a year of circling it and telling my writing mentor, yeah, I remember we meet every spring, one of my writing mentors, and he said one spring, so how's the biography? And I said, oh, well, I'm still circling it, trying to find, the best form to take. And he said, oh, great, see you in a year. And then a year later, so how's the biography? Oh, I'm still circling around it, trying to find it. It's like, I see. So there's a lot of that. And then finally, I realized that the story of his life was essentially just Jack and the Beanstalk, that it was about a boy who climbed, in his case, out of the Pennsylvania coal mines to a career where he could use his knowledge of chemical engineering to help get young men like him out of the coal mines, where his father and uncle, all sorts of, there were so many people he lost to this form of getting energy that he wanted to get energy in another way. And in his own words, sort of save the boys who had to go underground. This was a very personal career, and he kept this coal mining hat on his desk his whole life. And so I thought, if I can just, I know fairy tales, I'm educated in myth. I thought, if I can just write the book-length version of Jack and the Beanstalk, filling in the details of his life, essentially what I think of as mythic memoir or autobiography with sort of a fairy tale at the center, then I can do it. And I did do it, and it became a really lovely story where I use the framework of sort of climbing and the kind of angry giant of the mines who eats them in, but I was able to then put this story together and have it be factually accurate and have the science. I got the science all checked out. I had this. It was a solid biography, and it was the biography that I could write while he was alive and while I had a baby. That was a big that. I would have written a different book 10 years before if I had the time today. It would have been a different book again, but that was the book I could do. And in between each chapter were these sort of lyrical, poetic sections that I thought of as sort of the tendrils of the sort of the beanstalk tendrils that were just sort of poems of Jack and the Beanstalk to sort of tip the hat to the fairy tale. And so I, took this whole book proudly and kind of dumped it at my mentor's feet and was like, I've done it. Here you go, complete. And my mentor read it and was like, congratulations, great job. Now take out all the fairy tales.
Oh, okay.
And I, argued, but realized that that was very, very, very good advice, because my target audience was, was basically the several thousand of my grandfather's students who would be eager to read about their mentor and their hero. And they did not want the granddaughter's poetic interludes about beanstalks and giants. Like, they did not want that. So I realized that what I thought was the center of the book was the scaffolding, and that I was able to sort of scrape away all the fairy tale, except I left one at the end. I felt I had to leave one. And it was beautiful, and it held, and I couldn't believe it held. But if it's truly rendered inside the scaffolding, it should hold.
Yes. Yeah. And it is a fascinating way to do it. And this is what I really love about, blueprinting a book with a client. It is the scaffolding that it then is able to help them keep to being able to write forward with confidence. So two things I wanted to come back to. The first one is, how did you actually start writing? So you started writing poetry. How did that evolve and begin for you?
Yes, I started writing, and I remember hearing one of your podcasts when you said something wonderful like, I wish I could say I had been writing since I was a child. So I'm sort of, what's the right answer? I wish I could say. It's wonderful because there is sort of, there's so many different roads that make a writer, but all of them emerge as having, the desire to say something authentically, to communicate with meaning to someone beyond you in space and
Mm.
time. And I did have that instinct as a pretty little kid. I found somewhere before we moved out of my childhood home, a poem I'd written at age 8 about snow, which in growing up as a kid in Texas, like you don't see a whole lot of. So it was this sort of very magical poem about like, if it were to snow. So I think I always, my parents were big readers. As a kid who had a lot of books in the house, I always thought it was fun to create things. And I think actually the two things that would make up my life as an adult, teaching and writing, very much had their seeds in my childhood. And like pity my poor siblings who had to like sit down while I gave them lessons. It was a tough. God, firstborns are tough. So I did have that, but then I didn't. Then there was, so I had this sort of little, little kind of spurt of poetry as a very, very young child, and then just was always a reader. Like I know like many of us, and I know you mentioned you were too, just a big reader, and then didn't come back to writing until I was a teenager, and a quite anxious, depressed teenager, as I think is probably nothing special because probably most people at 16 and 17 feel that way.
Okay.
And I think most people at that age can probably feel that their particular brand of depression and loneliness was like incredibly isolating and unique, which is of course how I felt about mine as well. But I felt that in the sort of, loneliness of 16, a journal seemed like a safe bet to process all that stuff. Uh,
Right.
so I became an avid, as soon as I got my driver's license at 16 in Texas, which is a terrifying thought, I started going in the evenings to cafes to just write in my journal. So going back to your big journal collection, don't get rid of them, Stuart. Those are very special. Those are the things that we should keep. So I was a writer in this sort of in a way that feels very therapeutic. And so often when my students will come to my classes sort of wounded by a writing teacher or a coach or feedback that said your story is this draft is therapy not craft, in a way that sort of is a pejorative, like this is therapy, like I always want to sort of salvage that in terms of how important. I mean, I just think the first draft is the therapeutic draft.
Yes.
First draft is absolutely like unless we're in it for sales alone, and even then that's sort of, who knows. But if we're writing something that we feel we need to write, the first draft has our emotional fingerprints all over it, and should, I think, solve some question that is interesting and
Hmm.
meaningful to us, on which our soul depends, maybe in this era. It's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
personal what you need to write at a given time, but I certainly feel that's true for each of my books. And then you're a little psychically wiser at the end of that book, but it's very therapeutic. And then of course, between the therapeutic draft and the published draft, or I don't know, 70 more drafts, so many, like so many. But I think that we should always, raise our glass to the therapeutic first draft, because that is it's important, and it's what I think is like, I think we are healed through those drafts, and we are more empathetic and compassionate, and all the sort of what I call to my children the fairy tale values. All of those I think come through the practice of the first draft. So anyway, back to that side note. I wrote tons in my journal, like that carried on through college, and then I had an incredible experience my sophomore year in college, where I was taken in by a group of Cambridge retired women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Teacher was 96, and I wrote with them for 4 years. It was a memoir group who sent in every Tuesday an essay from our journals. And so
Okay.
I sort of cut my teeth as a writer on memoir, which again, like they were so generous um, to not laugh at me for that, because I
Yeah.
was 19 when I started, and on one end you could say, what memories do you have? But I wrote faithfully every week an essay from my life at college, about my college boyfriend, the sort of getting, the goings on in my dorm. Like I'd written 2 memoirs before I graduated from college, which in retrospect, I want to pat my younger self on the back. Neither of them are publishable. They're both therapeutic drafts, but good for her.
Yeah. And you know what? And I think, and it's interesting, like, especially like, young pop stars or young actors, they bring out a memoir, and people are like, yeah, but you haven't really lived your life. But there are some incredibly pivotal, turbulent things that happen when you are at school and when you are at college. And
Yes.
I think, if you are a teenager who's feeling very isolated, it's very powerful for you to be able to read that you're not the only one that's had or is having that experience. And I
Yes,
often find a memoir, I don't think people read memoir to learn anything about the person who wrote it. I think they're interested in it to find out what they can learn from it and then take into their own lives.
I agree completely. It's just this little pipeline from human to human. It feels just like a wisdom transfusion through the specifics of
Yes.
another life. It's such a, I so agree. We read it in a very kind of mirror moment way.
I've just written down wisdom transfusion.
I love it.
I'm stealing it. I'm stealing it.
Please, it is all yours. You're welcome to it.
So okay, so let me take you back to the American dream home. So it's you, your husband, two kids, two dogs.
Two dogs, but one of them was very old and died in the first winter of the tiny house era.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have a very, very poorly doggy here
Oh,
as well. 50% liver function, the best vets in the country. You have no idea what's wrong with her. So you are in your big house at this point. Life is life. There's stuff going on. Okay.
life is life.
How were you finding time to write, and what were your challenges in finding that time?
There were lots, and the main ones were always coming down to the sort of turbulence of mess and money. And I know those two are
Mm,
they're so boring in a way. They're so boring, but they're also so omnipresent that it
mhm,
felt like so much of my time was spent doing, like I had a, and I won't name names, but I had a couple of jobs at places just did not feel good, that I would
okay.
never have taken if it weren't, if it wasn't about the money.
Yeah.
Things like that, that just felt like I was making compromises for things that I ultimately didn't feel were important. If the only things that at the end of the day, when I imagine myself as old as the women in my writing workshop, if I wanted to remember a life of making a lot of books and of giving and receiving a lot of love to this group of people, like those were not at the center of my day. Instead I was
Right. Yeah.
driving 45 minutes to a class of students who like didn't feel like coming to class. Like I just felt very discouraged by the things that I found myself willing to do to make enough money to
Mm,
pay for what happened when the siding needed to be replaced. All the sort
yeah.
of
Yeah.
boring things that at the end of the day just felt so dumb. They felt so dumb, but they're
Yeah.
necessary. One must replace the siding. So for me, it was, I think about this sort of what I thought of as almost emotional spyware. It just felt like even if I did have, a few good hours of writing, it was infiltrated by my feeling of not having a stable floor in terms of
Mm,
what will be required of me tomorrow in order to continue work on this book or this project. What will be the next interruption? So that was a big one for me. I think for my husband, it was sort of a chaos of a different sort. But yeah, so for me, I felt highly distracted, and
right.
um, and I can't fully blame anything for that other, I can't fully blame the house for that one. Always I feel like my energy is way up here.
Yeah.
But the act of I think that felt all the more why a small space. I still feel like putting my feet on that sort of small concrete floor just felt so rooting. Like everything I need is in this room. The
Yes.
people that I need to care for most are in this room. Here's the dog. This is the project I'm working on today. It just felt like everything was taken down to the ground in a way that just really helped me focus on what is right there. I think I could probably make
Right.
comparisons to, be on the yoga mat, be in the sit on the meditation pillow. It just felt very much like it allowed me to practice life with more attention.
Okay. So, so only very recently gave up volunteering at my local library, and we would have people come to study, or students, and they would get away because it was a quieter environment. But you've gone from a life in 3,800 square feet to a life in 300 square feet. So I'm sure you love your family, but when they're right on top of you, how does that not distract you and your writing?
Yes. Well, cafes,
Okay.
libraries, absolutely necessary.
Right.
I do most of my writing. I do plenty of my writing outside the house, and
Okay.
think of the house. And in fact, one of our we call our house the shed. One of our shed tenants is that basically we're all out of the house between 9 and 5. So my
Right.
husband and I shared an office a few blocks away, which taught
Yeah.
us some good boundaries in terms of when he was going to have loud phone calls. I found that I really rooted down in being a morning writer because 2 good hours before dawn were worth 6 hours once people started talking to me. So
Okay.
I think a lot of it was just about setting good boundaries with time and with people and using the world around us. So part of moving the shed was getting passes to the gym, the Discovery Center, just so that we could be in the world more. But COVID meant that we were all on top of each
Oh,
other.
you were in the tiny house during COVID.
And we had planned
Oh,
to stay there for longer, for 5 years, but ended up moving to a slightly bigger house, not the big one, but a different one that
okay.
partly in anticipation, my husband sort of looking toward the winter and thinking this is going to be rough.
Yeah.
But for the summer, the first summer of COVID in that tiny house, I have to say it was lovely. It was lovely because again, it was that sort of essential, like it was the most time I'd spent with my children since they were babies. And now they were, of course, a lot more fun and a lot older,
Right.
a lot more capable. So they could, tell a good story and entertain themselves and cook. And, and because we didn't have the structure of school, we could kind of do what we wanted. So I made up a Shakespeare unit. I made up 2 Shakespeare units where I gave him like a little sticker chart with different activities about Midsummer Night's Dream. Like we're going to do, here's the one on money, or no, here's one on math. If Puck can sour 3 barrels of beer, things like that. Or one of them on like psychology. Like, can you advise Aegeus on why his daughter should have choice of who she marries? Things like that. So the kids and I had so much fun. And then at the end, their final project was to make a fairy dinner party. So we ate, cherries and like fruit. It was beautiful. So I just thought it was lovely to be in, it felt like we were living on this little microplanet of just our closest people. And
Right.
we had nothing
Okay.
to do but our own projects. And so it was very sweet. And I also recognized that that was sort of a sweet, charmed era that would have become a lot tougher going into a winter of all of us at home between 9 and 5,
Yeah.
trying to focus on our. So I think that the shed, it felt a little bit like the old Anya's Nin adage that it's always good to leave a party early while everyone is still behaved, versus Henry Miller, stay to the dregs and you see who people really were. I felt that because we ended our shed era sooner than we planned, it remains just this sort of beautiful golden period in our lives. Like we all look back on it and think we've never loved a house more. And my
Yeah.
husband and I still think like, will there be another shed era? I think now there won't be. Like now that our children are like, wait a second, we can have our own bedrooms. I think I think that is done for them. It's
Yes.
a really beautiful, beautiful, really, really happy 3 years.
Now, see that that's interesting. So as we've been recording, my other half has been in a meeting in the other room. My dog has been running around with a squeaky ball, and I've been feeling quite tense. So, as I said, I'm in a large house by British standards. There's only so far I can get away from somebody, but I wouldn't think about going to a cafe or a library purely because I have a study. So I would shut the door, but I still get distraction. I can still hear the postman coming. All of these things still bug me. And I think it's interesting that actually being in a much smaller space actually changed your behavior. So you actually removing yourself from a situation that you probably might not have thought to remove yourself from before. Is that a fair assumption?
In terms of working in libraries and cafes and
Yeah.
things. Well, I've always loved a library and a cafe, but I think it became I love how you describe it as sort of it's almost could be read as guilt, and I've certainly felt that. I felt I have a
Yeah.
perfectly nice office that I'm like, paying to fill with books and like I have a perfectly nice office. Why would I rather write at Java? And I can't always answer that question, but it is nice when the house answers it for me. That the answer can be
Right.
because they have better coffee than I have and blueberry muffins, and also because it'll give me 2 quiet hours before everyone is everywhere in this tiny
Right.
little space.
Yeah.
And there was one moment when, it's always funny how like poets do math, sort of it feels different depending on who reads the number how. But I remember our first year in the shed, I was feeling a little bit like I was going to the cafe too many times because I was going there 4 or 5 mornings a week to write, and it was super productive. And I was putting out a book a year, and it was like, it was wonderful. And all my friends and family knew what to get me for Christmas and holidays. They're like, just get her a Java gift card. But I remember sort of thinking I'd better add up what I spent on an average month to sort of get a real sense of this cost. And I did, and it was the exact same. It was the number that we had been paying for our mortgage each month. And I took that number to my husband and was like, I would gladly pay this for a year of Java. And he was
Yeah.
like, that's a lot of blueberry muffins.
How can you transfuse the listeners, the writers who are finding it difficult to find time and space to write? How do you think they could edit their lives to allow for writing?
Yes. So, dear writers who are looking for more time and space to write, what I would suggest is to take a very set, and maybe not as big as you think it needs to be, amount of time. Say take an hour, take 30 minutes, when you can just take yourself out of your normal environment. Take yourself for a walk or to a cafe. Take yourself somewhere where you feel that the sort of tentacles of responsibility aren't following you. And ask yourself what gives you the most energy about your project right now.
Mm.
And see if your answer surprises you. See if you have trouble coming up with an answer, and then maybe do that a few more times. There's no rule that it has to be once. Do it every day. Do it every day for a month. But give yourself a little bit of time to just kind of reacquaint with that project and ask, what do I appreciate about you? What interests me about you right now? Because it may be that what we cared about when we started has evolved, and that we're going about it, we're climbing the mountain the wrong way by putting our foot in a place that sort of doesn't exist in the same way for us anymore. So start with figuring out what is our entry point to this? And then once we found that, my guess is that some new water will flow into it simply because we found our excitement about it again.
Mhm.
But I think we do need to give I always think any project, and it would be so simple and nice if it were the same of these for every project, but it has never ever twice been the same for me. But I think that every project needs, in order for me to trust that I can show up for it every day without doubting that the work matters, it needs a time, a place,
Mhm.
treat. A time, a
Right.
place, and a treat.
Okay.
Java Cafe, 6 to 7:30 a.m., blueberry muffin and cold brew. And if I know that those sort of certainty anchors are there, scaffolding again, then I don't have to wonder where I go, when I go, what lovely treat lures me to the desk. I have those three questions answered, and then all I need to do is just follow my way to the seat and know that that time, which is not very much time,
Mm.
is reserved for that project. And then I guess the second thing, or I guess that's not the third thing that I would say, is to work by time engaged in it rather than task. Because at the end of the day, whether
Yes.
we write or paint or whatever the sort of unit is, less than we expected or more, ultimately what we want as artists is a life of looking back on a whole stack of beautiful days of getting creative. So that's what I
Mm.
would say, is just show up for a little bit. Think of it as a practice without fussing so much about what comes out of it. It may be that one day you show up to write your novel, but end up reading the screenplay for Coco because something about the underworld calls to you. But let that time be held for your creative and imaginative growth. That's what I would say.
Something, my whenever I listen to you talk, and certainly when I watched your TEDx talk, my mind was whirring, whirring, whirring. and it's something has just dawned on me. Okay, so I think a lot of people, a lot of writers feel like writing is indulgent. Okay, and that you know even if they're in the house, they are taking their attention away from the people that they might live with, the jobs that they should be doing, the calls that they should be making. And I meet a lot of writers who actually feel quite guilty about writing. And I've just had this like aha moment, which is if you are going to feel like writing is an indulgence, make it indulgent,
This is
right?
very wise. This is very wise.
Right.
Make it the treat you think it might be.
Absolutely. Go and have the good cup of coffee, although I hate coffee. Go and have go and have a good beverage and a muffin of your choice. Or a carrot stick, whatever. You do you. But
Wonderful.
I like this thought of embracing the indulgence
Yes, I love
because,
this.
yeah, because the more you indulge yourself, the more I guess you want to do it.
I think this is so wise, and I think you may have just improved my next project, Stuart. I think this is wonderful, and I think why not make the practice delightful? And I think that anytime we worry about the guilt, one thing that I think we should all keep in mind is that whenever, you know, totalitarian dictators take over, they always kill the culture first. You know, art is
Yes.
terrifying because it awakens feelings and thoughts and introspection. What we're doing
Mm,
is dangerous, important stuff. So I think we should always feel that we're contributing to culture in meaningful ways. And we should indulge the practice because treats.
yeah. I'm going to put even more weight on that. Do an hour blueberry muffin.
This is great. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I mean, I might need a widescreen the next time we talk. Okay, but that also brings me back to something else. And I don't think I think if somebody's writing a memoir, they have a better understanding of why they're connected to a piece of work. But if somebody's writing fiction or memoir that I'm coaching, the first question I ask is why are you writing this book? What's your personal connection to it? And it's kind of framed around, right, why are you the best person to write this book? And I actually changed that because the writer's reaction to that is, well, I'm probably not the best person to write that book. Somebody else could probably write it. So now it's more like, okay, what's your personal connection to this piece of work, right? However tenuous it might be. And then what's the point you're trying to make? And it doesn't have to be some big lofty, you know, concept. If you are writing about romance, you can boil that down to love conquers all. Okay. And then the third piece, I mean, there are like 18 steps that I do with writers, but one of the other pieces is, and who are you writing for? And again, it's like, well, people are age 30 to 40 who, speak English. I'm like, okay, that's quite broad. Like, let's try and get it down to one person. Let's get it down to, young Elisabeth, sitting in her room, writing journals. This is the music she listens to. This is the kind of dog she'd like to own one day. And then you are able to say, okay, this is my connection to this piece of work. And this is the point I'm trying to make to this person. This is the person who I hope will receive my book. This
Yes.
is the person who will buy my book, not the person who might buy my book. And to me, that combination of understanding is the rocket fuel
I love this. Yes.
that you can go and indulge in.
Yes, I love it. I think there's a wonderful quote that I sometimes fling at my students by Kurt Vonnegut that says something like, write to please one person. If you fling open the window to make love to the world, you'll catch pneumonia.
I love that. I love that. And and again, I've probably said it on this podcast many, many times, but when somebody says, "Oh, I want to be the next J.K. Rowling," and like, "Oh, I want my books to appeal to everybody," and I'm thinking, well, that's fine, but Harry Potter was written and marketed to 10-year-old boys. The
Right.
fact that parents caught on to it because they were reading it to them at night, and it, inspired this huge public love of it, generally speaking, was a happy accident.
Yes.
At the end of the day, she was writing for a particular audience, and ideally a particular little boy.
Yes, she was writing for a particular little boy. And when she talked about, I think it was in her Harvard 2008 graduation speech, which I thought was so beautiful, when she talked about how, no, it's not, anyway, one of the speeches, she talked about how much the book meant to its readers. And she asked the audience to imagine how much more it meant to her to be able to live in that world and work out these issues of morality and mortality when she was in such a rock bottom point. I think her story is exemplary for so many reasons. And write what you need, write what you need to write, what you need to read. And the rest of it is sort of not your business ultimately. Like people will love it, people won't. But at the end of the day, it's us in our tiny or big office with our treat of choice the next day, whether our book sells or not. At the end of the day, our days, it doesn't make that much of a difference.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is, I mean, fundamentally, I don't want to do a big psych dive into Harry Potter, but if you think about an orphan boy who lives with an aunt and uncle, and one day this kind of wizardy type person introduces him to the world of magic. There's an evil villain, blah blah blah, and that's Star Wars as well, right? So I think Luke and Harry have a very similar thing. They're yearning to get away.
Yes.
They're I don't know if Harry's necessarily yearning for adventure, but Luke certainly is. But they both want something other than what they have.
Yes.
And a few people kind of give me side eye when I say, well, Star Wars is the same as Harry Potter, and they're just like, what? But again, it's true, and I think these core messages come up time and time again, or at least generationally. And I think that's why we end up with these huge franchises that we have, Star Wars, we have Harry Potter. And I'm assuming in another, 20 years time, 30 years time, somebody else is going to have a story about an orphan child who finds out they've got these amazing powers.
Yes. Yes. This is such a good point. And they are all this, and I would go sort of back to the mythic core filled in with the specifics of a life that works for this particular generation, that all of them are, an orphan is the most vulnerable of unparent, there's no, in any fairy tale, like what happens in the first paragraph, mother dies, story begins, the idea of someone who has no one to protect them, rising to face the sort of biggest evil of their time, overcoming the biggest monster. It's such that myth has been one that our hearts as humans have beaten hard to for how many thousands of years. I mean, it's such an essentially important story that it does make sense that it would be. I love that. I love when the core of story is, it's got the same core, just sort of different specifics, which I think we can go even further down. And this is maybe too much of a reach, but I feel that's kind of what the lesson of memoir is, that all of our lives are pretty much driven by the same factors. Replace London with Austin, Texas, with Boise, Idaho, with Kauai, but ultimately, like, we're all navigating the same cycles of evolution. And I think it's a great practice in, mirror and empathy.
So we're moving to small houses, finding a really good coffee shop, and stuffing our faces with thoughts and muffin.
Exactly. There's true wisdom in this, Stuart.
Okay, now at the risk of sounding like Joanna Penn, where can we find you online?
So ElisabethSharpMcKetta.com and and sometimes Instagram. Then I always respond to every email through my website. But all my books are in, online through their publishers and through Amazon, and through most local bookstores.
Elisabeth, thank you again for talking to me today. I had so much fun.
This has been delightful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.